Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that was actually founded here in Austin, Texas originally. And they actually provide a lot of online resources that I think are good explainers for the technology that's being used in surveillance against activists and journalists across the country. So this is an illustration of a cell site simulator, which is also known as a Stingray. And it's a device that's used to spy on cell phone communications. And the illustration, I think, is actually pretty good because you can see that it's essentially a box with an antenna that sits inside of a truck, or it could sit inside of anywhere. And it's man in the middling. It's sitting between you and the actual cell tower, and it's intercepting your data. So that's where this starts. So the reason that's where this starts is because we carry these phones with us everywhere we go. And so when we go and we try to participate in climate justice activism and land defense, our phones go with us, and the information that they share with the authorities and with private security has an impact on our ability to effectively organize. And also, for the most part, this is something that has been going on for a lot longer than we've been aware of, and we are only now kind of starting to, I just want to mention that this is not actually new. It's just that we're only now really becoming aware of it. And I see that I have, oh, is that a chat? No, it's not. Oh, there's a new person. Hello, welcome. Go ahead and close that. All right, so let's move on. Oh, okay. So I just want to make a note on land defense. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the philosophy of land defense or Indigenous sovereignty in particular, but it is core to climate justice. Particularly, we can take the example of Standing Rock. The water that was being protected by the tribes there was actually the water for a wide variety of communities beyond the Indigenous communities there, which is one small example of an Indigenous community standing on the front line, standing literally on the edge of protected land, trying to keep the rest of us from suffering the impacts of climate destruction, as well as themselves, and being unfairly put in the position of bearing the full brunt of this military industrial complex that is pushing the pipelines through. So this photo has some pretty significant emotions attached to it for me. This is from the last child camp, which was actually the last newly established camp before the final raids of Standing Rock in early 2017. And this photo was taken by my friend Red Hawk, and kind of captures just the sheer disparity of impact and of resources that folks were being faced with. So I see there's a notification. Oh, the chat. Gotcha. Yeah, I do want to give some context for Standing Rock. So Standing Rock, most folks will know it as the No DAPL, No Dakota Access Pipeline struggle that took place in North Dakota in 2016. It stretched on into 2017. There were several camps established on the banks of the Cannonball River in direct opposition to the pipeline company. And they held their ground there under the leadership of the tribal communities whose territory that is for a number of months until being forced out by a combination of federal authorities and private security. So there was National Guard present, but there was also a number of private security companies, and we're going to touch on that in particular because it's relevant to this conversation about surveillance and the fact that surveillance no longer means just the government, it no longer means just the agencies and authorities that we tend to think about when we think of being spied on. So anyway, I'm going to keep going. All right, I just want to tie this in also to what's going on here in Central Texas, just briefly. So we do have our own pipeline struggles here in Austin. We have our own pipeline struggles in Texas. Frankly, we are also part of the list of communities, the huge list of communities impacted by the DAPL struggle also, actually, but because our water is actually still connected to theirs, even all the way up at the top of North Dakota. But in terms of highly localized, we have our own aquifer issues, our own pipeline being pushed through. And there's a lot of folks who have put the time in, and I'm not going to try to summarize their work, but it is available. They're also actively looking for more people to get involved and literally physically show up. We're seeing it's obviously a lot more difficult to organize physical action under pandemic safely, but we're seeing that the pipeline companies are using COVID as an opportunity to push further and faster as opposed to slowing down. And so here in Central Texas, we have an urgent need to push back against our own land destruction, and to the best of our ability to do that with the guidance of the Indigenous folks whose territories we are on. So, all right. I just want to make a touchstone on the Matrix, because I mentioned it in the intro, which is it's the notion, from the sci-fi movie of all of us being plugged into this giant machine, and it's, of course, that's absurd. It's over the top, but the more accurate version of that for what we actually have is the Panopticon, which is we have a situation where the new normal is that everything is spied on at all times, that everything is surveilled at all times. And if you're not familiar, the model of Panopticon is a construction for a prison where you have a viewpoint in the center that can see everything. It's a central point from which everything in that space is visible. And this erases the sense of privacy, but it also erases any sense of individual or collective sovereignty, which of course ties into pushing back towards actual land sovereignty and actual Indigenous sovereignty. And pushing away against this notion of the Panopticon and against this notion that we don't deserve to decide what is secret or what is private about us. Okay, so continuing on the private security anecdote from before. So at Standing Rock, we did have federal authorities and agencies spying on water protectors, but we also had private security companies. And in particular, there was a company named Tiger Swan that had a huge impact in terms of conducting a massive amount of disruptive stingray surveillance to the point that folks could not safely make phone calls for help. They couldn't consistently reach people in order to just get medical care or basic assistance. And this is actually an issue that's been raised in courts before. The notion that stingrays are not, as they are presented by both the private and government surveillance community, they're not just passive. They have an active aspect, and they have the ability to shut down calls and to stop people from making even 911 calls, which is pretty severe. And so this is something that when we're in a frontline scenario, a land defense scenario, particularly at Standing Rock, where folks were faced with blizzards and sub-freezing temperatures, not having the ability to rely on regular communications is fundamentally destabilizing, puts people's lives at risk, and it's completely unacceptable. So I'm having a chat. Yeah, no, that's not a stupid question. So is this legal? So the answer is not exactly. There's been several court cases where judges have called into question, hey, when you were using this device, can you prove that other people were still able to make necessary 911 calls, or can you prove that this wasn't shutting down, because the justification is always that, oh, we're only shutting down communications for those who, we're targeting because of whatever reasoning is given. When the reality, of course, is that anyone who's within a certain geographic area is actually going to be impacted, because they don't have the capacity, at least they have not demonstrated the capacity to only use it on certain devices. It's everyone in range. So what that means is that, yeah, you could just be standing too close, basically, to something. And the courts have brought this up, and time again, what's happened is that we've seen the authorities pull back on using evidence that comes from stingrays, on pushing forward any of their points related to the use of stingrays in courts, so that they can avoid having to get into proving that they don't have these issues, proving that this side effect isn't a problem. And part of that, the other thing I should mention, is that this is related to NDAs that have been signed between, and this is, I think, kind of legally crazy, but there are NDAs between the federal government and as well as local authorities and the cell site simulator stingray companies. So, but in particular Harris, which is the main company out of Florida that produces the majority of stingrays, they have these NDAs that are essentially preventing the government or private agencies from disclosing any information about their products. So like any hardware information, any specs, any names, any frequency of use, like anything. And it's pretty crazy that they even got them to sign that. But now that they have them signed, what we've seen is this cycle in court where when they come into contact with an NDA, they just say, well, we'd rather throw everything out that we have to in order to not break this NDA than break this NDA. And they just do that over and over again. And for some things, that may actually have an impact. Like that might actually result in evidence being thrown out that helps the defendant. But in many cases, it's not really relevant because the use of the stingray was more impactful at the time than it is in terms of its impact on producing evidence. So like your inability to call for help when you're in the middle of a blizzard is more critically impactful than like the data that they collected at that moment. And so they're consistently surrendering that data and saying, it's okay, we won't use this in court, just don't make us prove that this stuff is not, you know, causing all these other problems. And it's completely sidestepping all of these other impacts that we're seeing happen to people. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but hopefully that kind of gets at some of what the legality. Okay, so the impact of this is that we have like this notion of pervasive spyware, right? And that like within the activism community, which is huge generalization, but certainly within the climate justice community that I work with, there's this notion of pervasive spyware, of everyone having their personal FBI agent, and it's a joke, and it's you know, it feels like almost an insurmountable obstacle, which ends up kind of having a twofold impact. On the one hand, it's good because it means we're not paralyzed by this information. We continue to organize, we continue to do work, we continue to fight for what we believe in, even though there's people spying on us. That's great. However, you know, it also can have this sort of cumulative snowball of misinformation until eventually the general understanding that we're operating under, it is pretty much completely separate from what's really going on. And that can have some actually serious consequences. So this meme is funny, but it's also kind of hitting on some of that, which is that, you know, like, first of all, none of us have an FBI agent. If we have any agents, they're not FBI. And the joke is that it would be the NSA. Instead, it's a different agency, and they have different, you know, they have different rules that they have to operate by. They have different limitations. You know, they have different parameters as a government authority. And of course, Snowden is the whistleblower. So, and I joked you. Basically that, you know, like the reality of this giant, massive surveillance system is so overwhelming that like these key details can just get lost in the mix. And even, you know, those details determine the well-being of people like Edward Snowden, who choose to step up and say, hey, this is actually what's going on behind the scenes. So yeah, on that same note, no, we are not, we don't all have personal FBI agents, but there's truth in the idea, right? So the truth in the idea behind the meme is that, yes, we are all we're all having this dragnet applied to us. So our data, unless we protect it explicitly, is being caught in this huge dragnet. And they also can't afford to pay attention to all that data. It's just too expensive. It's a huge amount of cost and time and energy to actually make that data useful and understandable. So for you as a person, probably you're not the one getting sifted out of the dragnet, depending on what's going on in your life. Of course, if you are Edward Snowden, you are getting sifted out of the dragnet. If you're not, debatable. But the point is, no, they can't pay attention to all of us. And so it's not worth, you know, expecting that at every moment of your digital life you're being watched. At the same time, the other anecdote is that, and this is something that's changed over the last 5 to 6 years, is that they do actually collect information that they just hold on to, that they completely ignore and just hold on to. And when it's relevant, when it's important, they'll come back for it. And that is something that used to be more expensive to kind of stockpile all of that data. And now it's actually becoming easier and easier for them to do that, which is why we're seeing this tactic of, oh, well, we'll just collect everything. Don't worry about it. You know, worst comes to worst, we'll come back for whatever we need, because we can afford to now, partially because of the development of cloud technologies and other just like data money saving technologies and stuff like that. I'm trying to, because I moved you. All right. This is an illustration of the cell site simulator thing, just another visual in terms of like what's going on exactly. A man in the middle attack is a type of digital attack. It's not only for stingrays and this, but it does apply to this. And it's just essentially standing between your phone and the actual network. So the actual network tower for AT&T is trying to talk to your phone, and the stingray is standing in between saying, talk to me instead. And I literally could do an entire talk on just the details of how it works. It would bore you to tears, I'm sure. But the principle is that it's going to pretend that it's a cell tower. It's going to pretend that it's AT&T. And it's going to do everything it possibly can to look like the legitimate network that your phone is supposed to talk to, so that your phone tells it everything, basically. This is the principle. Yeah. All right. So all of that's really depressing. I'm sorry. What can we do? There's a lot of stuff we can do. But the first thing is we have to start by evaluating our level of risk. And it's very difficult to do that, I should say. But we have to do our best to come up with an approximation so that we're not overly paranoid, so that we're not stressing ourselves unnecessarily. And as I previously mentioned with the FBI agent to each person, we all are differently interesting or not to the dragnet that we're caught in. And so we have to recognize that we all have different levels of risk. We all have different levels of concern, and we don't need to necessarily apply the same digital security tactics to every single situation or every single person in order to make the right strategic choices. So starts with level of risk, then we take as many precautions as reasonably possible, and we apply our digital security culture strategies. So I also want to mention, we can also learn the technology. That was my approach, but that's a huge commitment, and it's a huge amount of time and energy to kind of dig into the details with all of this. So this is more of like a crisis management approach. Okay, so, all right, risk evaluation. So how paranoid are you? And, can you consider the factors involved in making yourself interesting from a data standpoint? Consider what you look like on paper. Consider the key factors of who you are, and try to, based on that, start to come up with an approximation of, maybe if you start by imagining the most extreme person, like the most surveilled person you can imagine, and then working backwards, where are you, right? So if that person is Edward Snowden, where are you? And I also want to mention that there's actually going to be an assessment released with the zine that I am working on. It's not ready just yet, but we're trying to put together a self-assessment that will be like an actually formal point system for all of these factors. Okay. Step 2, besides getting a sense of your risk, is taking some actual precautions. So primary precaution that's actually helpful is encryption. Encryption is just a digital lock on your data. Again, I can get into detail on that for anyone who's interested, but I'll skip over it. It can be applied to your email, your text, your Wi-Fi traffic. It could be applied across the board to every action you take on your computer if you wanted to. But once encrypted, it's really difficult to understand the data, because essentially what's happened is it's been put through a cipher and it's now unreadable without being decrypted. So that means it's not impossible for someone to read it, but it takes a huge amount of effort, money, and time. So most likely it's not going to be worth it to decrypt every single one of your text messages if you're using an encrypted text messenger like Signal, for example. But it is theoretically possible, if it was worth it to someone, that they could apply the compute power to just that, but it's pretty unlikely. So that's why the parentheses is there. It's also accessible. So this is one of the big misunderstandings with encryption. It's actually pretty highly accessible. Like, you do not need to understand the details of how encryption works in order to make use of it, and you definitely don't need to keep up with how it changes over time. There's plenty of products and platforms out there. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, that will provide you with ways to encrypt your information. And depending on what it is that you're trying to do, there should always be a secure way to do it, which is brings me to the first resource I'm really excited to share, which is an encryption toolkit that I have put together. It's just a list of equivalencies. So if you're saying I would like to find a, let's say a Zoom equivalent that's encrypted, there will be a list there. I would like to find an SMS text app that's encrypted. There will be a list there of available options, and it says, what's free, what's paid, etc. And I'm going to continue adding on to that resource. It's intended to be a community resource, but it's also an encrypted community resource. So it's encrypted and it's password protected. And I'm happy to share the link, happy to share the password with everyone. Also, if anyone wants to contribute, add things to the list that I haven't heard of, I would love that. Just let me know. But yeah, so the first step is to figure out your level of risk. The next step is to encrypt what you can, what is reasonable for you. Okay, and then the third thing is security culture. So I just want to touch on what is security culture. I have a definition here. I'm not going to read it, but essentially security culture is our interpersonal culture. It's the way that we approach the work, and it's part of the way we approach the work, and the intent is that it protects us. So it protects us, it protects our communities, it protects our ability to organize. Specifically, digital security culture is related to our security culture around technology. So some principles of digital security culture. First of all, treating your phone like a person. So a lot of direct action organizing communities apply the need to know only principle. And we can apply that same principle to people, but we can apply that same principle to our devices. So normalizing not having any phones or having no phones meetings, which a no phones meeting is simply a meeting where you're going to be discussing details that you're concerned might be caught in some surveillance dragnet. And so rather than even worrying about it, you simply spend 5 minutes at the start of the meeting to collect everyone's phones, put them in a box, put the box in another room, and then you have the meeting. And it does feel a bit paranoid at points to ask people to do this. Sometimes people don't want to hand over their phones, but honestly, it is the most surefire way to just have a conversation privately, quickly, without having to deal with the specifics of everyone's devices and what's going on with them. So normalizing no phones meetings is a good idea. And then, coming back to this, treating the phone like a person, it's like a person in that it's collecting all this information. It's collecting this GPS data. So it knows where you've been. It's collecting your photo metadata. So if you go take a photo of something, it captures where you took it, when you took it, in the metadata, even though it doesn't show you that, and application credentials. So that's like your passwords. Like if you have a bunch of other stuff on your phone, all of those things that your phone knows about you, it's best to envision that as something that like that hypothetical person knows about you, and to make your trust choices on that basis. So if you can, exclude your phone as much as possible from spaces where you're trying to organize in a high degree of trust, and recognize that introducing the phone, if you need to introduce the phone, is a risk, and that it's a choice. So if it's a need to know, it's a necessary thing. So if you have to bring it into the space, if you need to bring smartphones into the space out of a sense of emergency, out of a sense of necessity, just recognize that it is a trade-off and that it is a choice. Okay. Also, Faradays and microwaves, military surplus, ammo boxes. So if you don't know what a Faraday is essentially a invisibility cloak for your device. It is a metal shield, and it can be made out of a number of different objects, but it's a metal shield that blocks incoming and outgoing signals. And it sounds very conspiracy theorist, but it actually does work. And I've made them out of all kinds of different materials. I've made them in the field and I've made them at home. They're really useful in the sense that that dynamic I just named of putting all the phones in another room can be really difficult depending on where you are. And if you're trying to travel, if you're trying to move from place to place, having a Faraday accessible to you where you can put all of your devices into it when you don't need them and be absolutely certain that there's nothing weird going on with them during that time is a great source of peace of mind. So that's another suggestion. And we can get into detail on like how to make these, how to buy these. They can be made very cheaply. I want to note that I would normally at the very top of this list have burner phones, but because we're under a pandemic, I can't reasonably recommend that you go acquire burner phones because it's really difficult to safely get used hardware right now. But normally that would be like one of the main digital security culture strategies, is to use burner phones and to use old devices that are not linked to you, that do not have a tremendous amount of your data on them. So that's something that we could talk more about if folks are interested, but I just didn't want to get into it under pandemic. Okay. I'm just going to see how I'm doing right now on time. Okay. So these are some of the resources that I have to share. So the Encrypted Applications Toolset is what I mentioned before. The security zine, which is actually still a work in progress, and the Emergency Livestream Solutions team. So that actually is an ask. So the first two are resources, and the last one is an ongoing project that is an ask. If there is anyone who is interested enough to like really dive in to learning some of this tech code nonsense, I would really honestly love anyone's genuine help with live stream solutions. And this intersects with ongoing climate struggles in so-called Canada. There are a number of Indigenous youth-led climate organizations there that are struggling or have been struggling over the course of the last year to successfully orchestrate actions where they have reliable live stream coverage. And the reason for that is because police will use hardware technology to shut down their live streaming capacity. And then the result of that is that we don't have eyes on youth when they're in situations with police. We don't have the accountability that we need in those situations. So it's a really urgent issue to try to get some secure live streams, some robust live streams going. And it's actually a very difficult, like high-level project, so much so that even with my experience, I'm pretty much learning a bunch of new stuff doing it. So if anyone's interested, I would really love some help, but I just thought I'd throw it out there. That first resource is what I recommend as like a starting point, and I will make that link available to anyone who wants it. Yeah, and I guess I thought I would get to this earlier. Oh, okay. Sorry, this slide is not where I thought it was. Okay, I also want to touch on DEF CON. So DEF CON is a hacking convention that takes place every year in Vegas. It's a great learning opportunity. It's also a great example of a physical space where it would be good to apply digital security culture and think about what devices you're bringing and what they have on them and all the rest of that. So when I go to DEF CON every year, I typically take a burner phone, I take cash, and I try to leave everything I possibly can behind because it's a high surveillance space. It's a space with a bunch of other hackers who are surveilling the network and messing with the traffic. So messing with the devices that are on the network. So I take those precautions. And because I take those precautions, I get to actually enjoy the conference. And I would honestly recommend it to anyone who is kind of curious about this weird like hacker world of digital activism and all the rest of it, because honestly, I've met a lot of really welcoming folks who are incredibly willing to teach and share their skills. And I think that it's a lot more welcoming of a community than it seems. And if you can take that kind of first step to just do yourself the favor of not bringing your devices with you, it's really not really anything to worry about. A lot of people are kind of scared to go to DEF CON, but I tell them I've met some of the nicest people ever there. So, and then I guess the last note there is that I do code mentorship with folks, both one-on-one and in groups for projects, but it is kind of dependent on my availability. So if you're interested, just reach out to me and let me know. And this little note about Proton Mail to Proton Mail is, so one of the tools in the encrypted toolset is Proton Mail, which is an encrypted email client. It's very much like Gmail. They also have a mobile app that works pretty great. I use it for almost everything. And it is fully encrypted, but it only works end-to-end encrypted, perfectly encrypted, if it's within their system. So Proton Mail to Proton Mail. So that's why it says that's preferred. If you make a Proton Mail and you send me an email through there, it will be perfectly encrypted end-to-end. So that would be great. Okay, I think I kind of blew through my content. I got really excited. But I feel like there's got to be a lot of stuff that either I didn't give enough detail or I went too quickly. So if anyone has questions, please feel free. I'm going to go back to the start so I can revisit whatever gets asked. Or just feedback also. Questions, feedback.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a programmer as well, and I thought
Hi.
it might be a good idea if you would talk briefly about Taylor Swift, how she's kind of a cybersecurity icon in the security space.
About who? What? I didn't hear you.
Oh, it might be a good idea to talk about how Taylor Swift is a cybersecurity icon.
Taylor Swift, the country music star?
Yeah, do you know about this or no?
I mean, I'm not really a Taylor Swift fan, but I don't.
Oh, no. I'm not talking about her music, but there's some really good profiles on how she's become a sort of idol in the cybersecurity world because of the lengths that
Really?
because of the lengths that she goes with everything that you're talking about of how to protect your data and how to be on top of surveillance.
Well, yes. I mean, we do not have T Swift nudes. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I didn't know that. I have to go Google that now.
To look up if anyone wants to see like real world applications.
Okay.
This on
yeah.
Level. Do you mean like with her fans' data or like what she's
promoting?
No. I don't know what you're talking about.
The way she protects all of her personal data and all of the projects that she works on.
I mean, I'm assuming that she's pretty serious about that. Like, yeah. Well, because also I would say, coming back to like the digital strategies and how burner phones would have been top of my list if they could have been, there's just a lot to support the idea that the best you can possibly do always is to just replace the device. But of course, that's super expensive, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're Taylor Swift, I fully believe that you can replace an infinite number of devices and sufficiently air gap all of your security. I don't know. I didn't know this. I did not know this at all. You are introducing me to knowledge. I've completely never heard of that. Okay. But yeah, was there any feedback? Actually, now that I know you're a programmer, was there any feedback or questions? Is this all new to you, or you old hat IMSI catcher?
I mean, I'm not a security or web programmer. Part of the reason why I never got into that is because once you dip your toe into it, you start to learn that everything's broken all of the time, and that's too stressful for me. So, but yeah, I know I understand a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, but I'm sure other people don't. So yeah.
I know you're right. It's so you do, once you scratch the surface, it's like everything is broken, or very easily breakable. And yeah, I do think that one reasonable response to that is that's really stressful and scary. But on the other hand, it also means that a lot of the things that are, a lot of the systems in the world that we know to be incredibly corrupt and horrific are also incredibly fragile. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is hope there. I think that the hope is recognizing that it's a double-edged sword, and that the chaos that is created by everything being hackable also generates space for potential opportunity and possibilities that were completely non-existent in other periods of our history. One thing that, so DEF CON has a lock picking village, which is like a really analog, kind of adorably, I think, awesome analog activity for folks to do in between, rounds of typing on screens. But people, sitting there picking locks and talking about like the concept of lock picking and locks in general, and, encryption as a digital lock. And I think that it's, again, in terms of finding the silver lining, recognizing that we've had a huge amount of time with physical locks as our primary means of securing control in the world. And we've now undergone a complete shift from that in the last like couple of decades, we've seen this exponential movement towards automation, exponential movement towards digitization, and the assumption, of course, with the powers that be that are initializing that move, is that the result will be a higher degree of control and a higher degree of internal consistency for them, right? But the reality is that these systems are not so perfect. They are not so obedient. They are more porous. They are more fragile. And by making that jump, they may have saved themselves a bunch of money. They may have made things more efficient. They may have, you know, fill in the blank advantages. But there is always going to be this other side to it, which is that they introduce a certain level of chaos and they introduce a certain level of unknowns. So I think there's hope there. I think there's hope amidst the darkness. But I do think that, like, it's very scary to face where we are with technology right now. But what I see that worries me is folks who get so overwhelmed that they kind of give up and they like decide that it's not worth trying. And I think that's obviously a recipe for disaster, but also it's just sad because we do have strategies, we do have ways that we can think around these issues and sidestep some of these problems and enable us to not work against ourselves, basically. So yeah, anyway, that's long feedback for your feedback. Does anyone have any other questions or anything else that was kind of fuzzy, or, you know, they want more detail, more context?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could talk more about I have a hard time understanding the scope of this problem. Like, I know that there's differing. It's really hard to tell how many people are being surveilled because they're obviously not being transparent about this. And I feel like I've read a bunch of different articles about how bad this problem actually is. How bad is it? You know,
really bad. Can you talk really bad. I have a graphic that I didn't put in this from a different presentation. That's the ACLU's graph of this country, of stingray use in this country from 2018. So it's 2 years old, and it's almost every single state in the continental United States. And they have percentage of use or whatever for each state. And I think there's an updated one probably to be released soon. But the ACLU has, I think they listed that there's at least 70 different organizations that have this hardware and this technology, that have this capacity. I forget, that might not be the exact correct number, but it's in that ballpark. And the number is constantly changing because also, you know, for example, in the case of Tiger Swan, there's organizations that start out as technically embedded within the government or part of government military apparatus like Blackwater, and then they eventually spin off and they retain their hardware. So at one point they may have been counted as part of a larger agency, and now the reality is that they're using it to do their business as they see fit, separate from that. So it's complicated to get an accurate picture. There's definitely a lot of resources I can share if you want the exact numbers for, you know, folks who are trying to keep track of it. The other thing is, you know, you can keep track in terms of actual responses and impacts on people's lives, but there is a huge disparity between who sees an actual impact and who's getting surveilled. There's a lot more people getting surveilled than see an impact, which is part of the problem, of course, is that the general population isn't being made aware by nothing about this technology makes you aware that you're being caught in the dragnet. So the collective response, the collective rage of why is this happening, people aren't aware of it for the most part. Yeah, so I think I was gonna, I don't think I can easily pull it up, but I will find those links and I'll make them available. I can add them to a document on CryptPad and share that with KB. Yeah, so there's I would say The Intercept is a really good place also, just in general, if you're looking for more detailed journalism on stingray use, because they have been one of the few publications that's really stepped up to the plate to document what's going on in the last few years. Yeah.
I have like maybe a dumb question.
Right.
So like you shared that sort of like email platform. What other, like if we're, so, you know, like I understand that if we've got our phones in the room, we've kind of already like, we're already kind of plugged in that sense. But like, so if we're using our phones, our laptops, like, are there like certain platforms or like browsers that you would recommend to sort of field information?
Yeah, so this list at the top is that. This list at the top, this encrypted applications toolset, is just a list of all the applications and their equivalents, and whether they're paid or free and all the rest of it. I'm trying to add more detail, but it's decent, and I am happy to share it. The only reason that I bothered to encrypt it because it's on CryptPad, which is an encrypted platform too. It's actually got a lot of G Suite features, but encrypted. But also because, frankly, I think that this is a community resource that should be shared with people who actually want to take that precautionary step to encrypt their stuff. And even though I want it to be like freely available, I don't want it to just be like not password protected, public or whatever, because I would prefer that as we try to evolve these strategies, that we do our best to keep them private. I mean, it kind of makes sense. So yeah, there is a laundry list there of options, and that's definitely the most common questions I get is like, I want to do X, but not with the government watching me. How? So anyone who wants to add to that, who has more ideas, also please let me know. Yeah, but thank you for that question, Gabby, because you literally set up that pitch. It was perfect. Thank you. Cool. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I really want to touch on. Yeah, I guess like I would just maybe revisit the empowerment note that like it is possible to make this jump and to like encrypt your stuff and keep tabs on your data. And it's not going to be absolutely perfect, but it should give you some peace of mind, I hope. And then, you know, the long-term impact is that as you're stepping forward in your community in the ways that are appropriate to you, you'll have some peace of mind in that scenario as well, that like you're not contributing any problematic data, that you're not, you know, working against yourself or working against your community, you know, inadvertently with your technology. And like that, to me, that matters a lot. That's a huge, you know, motivator, sense of hope and positivity, that like that is actually within my control to attempt to do that instead of kind of just having to hope for the best. But yeah, so that's my last little note there. And I guess I will turn it over to you, KB. I'm kind of at my end of my yellow brick road. Although, like I said, I can go into detail, but I feel like some of this is more valuable to process these ideas and to start thinking about how it applies, you know, to your own activism, your own relationship with climate justice work, rather than you know, me explaining all the details of how a stingray works to you. But I could if you really wanted to know that. But yeah.
You have literally so much time left. So like, does anyone else have any questions? No question is a bad question.
I have another question that I just put in the chat. Sorry if it's like kind of long and convoluted.
Oh, it's fine. I just didn't see it.
I mean, I can also paraphrase it. It's like, I am curious, like, if you could talk about how I can convince like relatives who do not know about this problem, who have no concept of like what they're signing up for when they're like buying products like Ring doorbells and Alexa. Like they're bringing these devices into their home that are collecting their data and then working with the federal government to like sell their doorbell footage. But like, how do you explain that to like your 75-year-old grandma or whatever? Like, yeah, don't buy this product, like don't do this stuff. Like, how do you get this through to people's heads? Because I feel like a part of the problem is like people are voluntarily handing over some of their data because they don't get the problem. Like, how do we have these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that is a common issue. So everyone has older relatives that maybe have a different relationship with technology than they do, and it's difficult to communicate all of this. It's a lot of complexity to condense. So usually, I guess my first recommendation would be to err away from trying to give a totally accurate assessment of what the issue is, because as much as that's, as much as I do want to advocate for being honest with folks, I think that it can be overwhelming and scary. So rather than starting from like, hey, your doorbell is watching you, moving like kind of a few steps back from that and just suggesting like, hey, like this is a complicated piece of technology, and the folks who are behind it, like who designed it, they put these capacities here because they're going to try to make use of them. They're going to try to profit from them. And like, you should recognize that when you're paying for that fancy doorbell, you're paying for all of the ways that they've figured out how to turn a profit out of that, how to make money off of that. And that includes data. And that includes, it gets rung, I don't know, 1,000 times a day or whatever, like whatever they keep track of. Actually, I'm pretty sure that Ring does not keep track of your rings. Ring just has the Ring doorbell has the camera on the top, right? That's the one I'm thinking of that you're talking about. Yeah. But yeah, so like trying to communicate to them that data, that capacity, that technology like has a cost, without phrasing it as like adversarial. I think, and that's just my 2 cents. I think it's easier to understand it in terms of like a cost benefit analysis of like, hey, this is something that I'm paying for, but do I really want what I'm paying for? Am I paying for what I think I'm paying for? Like, what is the relationship there, rather than being like, hey, be scared of your devices because they have this capacity that is, not obvious to you, that you can't see. So I don't know. I honestly don't think that there's one good answer. I think that there's always going to be a different strategy for the person. But the other big recommendation is that I try not to get into an argument, because I feel like the technical detail side, especially as a nerd, I can go down that rabbit hole real quick, where I'm like, here, let me just tell you all this stuff that you don't need to know. And it'll be exciting for me to feel like that person's listening to me, but honestly, I know they're not listening to me. So even if they're like pushing, like, no, explain to me how is this data used? Like, explain, like, I honestly will push back in those scenarios and just be like, no, I'm not going to do that, because honestly, like, I don't think it would be helpful. And that can sound condescending, but I've just had it go so badly to do the opposite, that I don't think it's worth it. But yeah, so. Any other questions about maybe applying some of these strategies, these security culture strategies, the Faradays, or any of that? I feel like we kind of brushed over that stuff. Yeah, I'm rereading your thing in the chat. And yeah, average people definitely don't understand the scope of the problem. Yeah, and it's not accessible. This information isn't accessible, the understanding of the scope. So.
I have a question that I'm not totally sure how to formulate, but I'll try and ask it anyway, which is like, as people can't physically meet up anymore and take on some of the protective measures that you're able to in a more physical setting, like what sort of strategies beyond sort of this like tool set that's super helpful, like what are some strategies that people are like thinking about or coming up with? Like, what are some of the questions that people have? Just because like this is a really new, I mean, people can't meet and organize in the same way. And so like if you're trying to organize an action at this point, like it all has to be digital.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so we've seen different attempts at social distancing actions, or you've seen the car actions, car marches, and we've seen people take on, trying to come up with different ways to still take direct action. But definitely, like, it's incredibly challenging to figure out how to react to this. I mean, for me, like I said, my first best standard recommendation is, you know, keep rotating your hardware, and that's almost impossible for people to do right now. So I don't have a great answer for you, but what I will say is that I'm seeing folks do, I guess, kind of a couple of things. I'm seeing some people organizing more online, more heavily online, and trying to, you know, maybe work more digitally than they did before, which is also part of why they're trying to move on to Signal, or they're trying to move on to encrypted platforms. I'm also seeing some folks who are kind of taking this as, I guess, like an opportunity to reformulate how we think about organizing and try to come up with ways to still have that community accountability without having that in-person meeting, but also, you know, not breaching this trust, not creating data problems. And so how do we do that? And honestly, that is a huge conundrum. One insight that I'll share is that, you know, we do have a sense of our common struggle. We do have a sense of our common adversaries, and so and our common ailments. And so because we have that, even though we might not be able to meet in person and have the like lengthy discussion we would like to about exactly what should happen, there are ways that we can kind of, from our shared sense of community, derive general principles of action and check up against general principles of action. And I know that sounds very vague, but actually the whole point is that it is vague. The idea is that we come up with more vague descriptions of what it is that we are trying to do and how it is we are trying to do it, so that we can validate that together without putting in that detail that is inappropriate and that causes problems to the actual follow through. So I don't know if that's a good, I tried to condense that. I feel like I got a little long-winded. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and honestly, that is something that I would welcome any feedback. Also, anyone who like has more thoughts or questions about like organizing under pandemic, climate justice under pandemic, fighting pipelines under pandemic, because this is the totally unprecedented situation that we're in, and I definitely struggle to adapt a lot of my recommendations to that. So yeah.
Amazing. God, I feel like I've learned so much. Does anyone have any other questions for Althea?
Also, feel free to ask me separately of this. Sorry, I'll go back to the slide with my email. Yeah, feel free to ask separately if you want to. And if you are ever, you know, honestly, I do a lot of trying to help people put out fires. If you're ever freaking out, trying to figure out what to do about a device that's misbehaving or something, feel free to email me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah.
So the last thing I want to do, y'all, is just provide y'all with a couple of links. So Althea's presentation was part of a larger series that Interfaces has going on called the Artist On series. This Artist On series is Artist on Climate Change and Sustainability. So we have folks talking about cybersecurity and climate justice. We have folks talking about food, Black eco-poetics, and so many things under the sun. So I want y'all to have access to other events that we have going on during this series as well. This series is also a part of the City of Austin's Sustainability Office ambassador program that they're doing in efforts to hear from community about ways that sustainability and climate change practices could be better in Austin. A thing that they are doing is listening in on these kind of like informal conversations that we're having around climate change, and using those things to help create a new community climate plan. If you would like to do any kind of like interview survey with them, I'm gonna leave a link for that. Also, Interfaces has this new newsletter, which I'm super excited about. The newsletter is going to have, for instance, the YouTube link to this presentation, because as soon as we're off the call, the recording is going to process, and then I'm going to post it to YouTube. And it has community resources in it. It has similar events to what Interfaces puts on, like happening in the community. And I just think it's a nice little thing to get in your inbox once a week. So if you want to sign up for that, we'll also post the link to that. Please follow us on Instagram, ATX_interfaces on everything. And feel free to support our cause. If you have some rich aunts also, we love that. Tell them to like send some change our way, because we are a volunteer run organization. So cool, I got all of that there. Also, I want to let everybody know it is a way to save the chat. So if you go to those little like 3 dots or whatever over to the chat and go to save chat, you should be able to save it if you want to look at it at a later time. And again, everything that Althea had, we are also posting on YouTube, this whole video. So thank y'all so much for coming. And I look forward to seeing y'all at a future Artist On. But
Thank you so much, KB.
yeah, thank you, Althea. Thank y'all for coming. Bye. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.